So welcome to the third of the IER Presents series, BioArt Talks at CBIS. I am Kathy High, and along with my colleague, arts professor Brandon Miller, I co-program the arts department series IER Presents. Brandon and I both do. These BioArt Talks are also sponsored by RPI, or Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute's Center for Biotechnology and Interdisciplinary Studies, which is CBIS, the arts department, and the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. And also, we're co-sponsored today by the Sanctuary for Independent Media's Nature Lab initiative. So I'd like to start by begin today with a land acknowledgement. Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute resides upon the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are indigenous peoples of the lands of New York. Despite tremendous hardships and being forced from their lands, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Muncie community. We honor this community, past and present, and are committed to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. The BioArt Talks at CBIS are a series of online presentations given by internationally recognized bioartists. Now, bioartists work with biological materials and use biotechnology to produce their artwork, looking at the materiality of biosystems and the processes used in biotech and scientific research. And so I'm a bioartist, and so this is why I'm interested in this field and inviting all these incredible speakers. The artists in this series cover a broad range of topics, including research into the history of gardens, human behavior and future bodies, assisted technologies, non-human interactions, and queer hormone disruption. The BioArt Talk artists include, the last two we had was Orkan Telhan and Heidi Boisvert. Today's guests, Aisen, Caro, Chacin, and upcoming Anna Lindemann and Mary Magic. All of these talks are being recorded, so they will be put up online, and so that we'll be sending you the links. The funding for this series has been generously supported by funds from the New York State Council on the Arts and by approval of the New York State Legislature and the governor. We are truly grateful for this support. So I would like to give you a little bit of biographical info to Dr. Aisen Caro Chacin, who is an artist and medical prototyper and the lead of a medical prototyping lab at the University of Texas Medical Branch. She holds a BFA in sculpture and a minor in visual studies from the University of Houston, where she's an affiliate faculty of New Media Arts. She has an MFA in design and technology from Parsons, the New School in New York City, where she was an adjunct professor of physical and creative computing. She creates a framework for assistive technology and device art while attaining her PhD in human informatics at the University of Tsukuba, Japan. I hope I said that right. She's the chair of the Laser Houston, which is a series of science talks sponsored by Leonardo, ISAT, and Trans Art Foundation for Art and Anthropology. And she's also a board member of the Medical and Media Arts program at UCLA. Her work lies in the intersection of art, science, and technology with a focus on new media, human-computer integration, medical devices, sound art, and assistive device art. And she's presented and exhibited at such esteemed places as Ars Electronica, Psych du Design, TEI, NIME, New York City Museum of Art and Design, the New York Hall of Science, Contemporary Arts, Museum Houston, and World Haptics and South by Southwest. We were actually in a show together, yay.
Yeah.
It was great. Okay, and so today's talk, BioArt and Assistive Device Art, Transformation of Ability and Perception, the Plasticity of the Mind, and Human Expansion. In this talk, Dr. Aisen Caro Chacin will be speaking to us about the genesis of BioArt, which is really great because I haven't done this in these talks. So thank you for doing that. And assistive device art. The convergence of experience necessary to create these kinds of artworks is a platform to generate discussions and new directions for research between health practitioners, bioethicists, and artists to envision alternative biofutures that are humanistically, socially, and aesthetically conscious and concerned. So I'm very much looking forward to this talk. Please join me in welcoming Aisen. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for that introduction. So I shall share my screen and begin. All right. Hello. I can't see you guys anymore, so I just want to have that disclaimer first.
We see the screen though, and it looks really great.
But you can see what is important, which is the presentation. So I suppose I don't have to introduce myself anymore, but I am Aisen. And I never really know how to say I'm an artist, I'm a scientist, I'm a tech. So I came up with this fancy art site, techist. We'll see how long that lasts. But essentially my work kind of oscillates between art and science. And more lately, I've been thinking about my work more as bioart, even though it's not necessarily microbiology or genetically involved all the time. But bioart is this field that started with Joe Davis in 1986. And it was when he created this artwork called Microvenus, where he genetically engineered an image based on this female genitalia that then was converted into a ones and zeros matrix that you can still see the drawing here. And then that was converted into a complementary strand of DNA. And so many of you may know Joe Davis, but he is an artist that is both an MIT and Harvard at the moment. And so with this pioneering work, this whole field began in 1986. And then it wasn't until 2000s when Eduardo Kac coined the term bioart with his GFP bunny, which is a bunny that was genetically modified to include the glowing fluorescence protein, the green fluorescent protein. And so even though this image has been enhanced a bit, the bunny did glow green. And now I think that one of the most provocative pieces in bioart, it is specifically talking about genetics and microbiology, is Impose, the work by Charlotte Jarvis, and where she worked with a group of scientists to create sperm from her own cells. One lab had created cells from her skin that then were turned into sperm by a different lab. Of course, this artwork, this sperm wasn't fertilizing anybody, so the ethical implications of the actual experiment were, I'm sure, okay with the IRB because it wasn't posing a risk to anyone. But what it did is, to actually materialize this very important philosophical question about where we're going with genetics now that we are consciously evolving as a species. Here's another work from Charlotte Jarvis. It's called Music of the Spheres, where she suspended a music library in DNA in a similar fashion in which Joe Davis had created Microvenus. And so there's no music to be listened to. It's just kind of to be absorbed by these music of the spheres. And so as we go into bioart beyond the microbiology and the genetics aspect of it, we start kind of going into device art. And so here is an artwork that is kind of a performative artwork of medical gynecology, and it's the Gynapunk Lab. And together with Gaudi Labs, they created a speculum that was 3D printed, and so encouraging women to look into their own cervixes and try to see their own fluids under a DIY microscope. So device art is another field in art that kind of converges with bioart nowadays. And it started in Japan in 2004. And the idea of device art is that the device itself is the content. So there's part of a performance that surrounds these devices. And so the characteristics of device art is that the device is the content itself, and that tool and content are no longer separable, that artworks are often playful and can sometimes be commercialized into devices. And then it's also talking about refined design and playful features that are traced back to the Japanese tradition. I don't know if you are familiar with the concepts of art within Japanese culture, but we in the West consider art to have different kind of craft, fine art, and design to be different. But in Japan, there is no distinction, and so video games are considered just as much a fine artwork as a clay cup, as a painting or a woodblock print. And so Dr. Hiriwata, who was my sensei during my PhD in Tsukuba University, it's one of these pioneers of device art. And he also created this artwork called the floating eye, which takes your perception and kind of dislocates it from your body, your visual perception, and by putting a camera on the Zeppelin and then projecting the vision of the Zeppelin onto this sphere. And so you can start now kind of having an outer body experience where your vision includes your own self as part of the visual scope. And so with this, I say that human capabilities are limited by the obstacles of our physical condition, whereas the mind roams free in the realm of endless possibilities in our imagination. The ambition to extend our senses, our bodies' reach, and even lifespan is embedded in the very DNA that tells our evolutionary history. We are adaptable beings capable of surviving and thriving, and all because of our relentless ingenuity. Our extension begins from understanding the very axons that propel our neuromotor and control, dividing and conquering information through crowdsourcing and sharing digital workspaces to the abstract ideas of device art. Our devices have made us transformable beings, a large connected organism of individuals, each a node capable of transferring any thought in a single tap or click to the rest of our connected humanity. Devices distinguish us from other animals, they make us human. And so the idea here that I'm exploring is that now that we have gotten to the point where we are consciously evolving with genetics, just today, the scientists that had genetically engineered the babies from the two fathers that were HIV positive for them not to have HIV. They knocked out the genes so that they were able to be born healthy without the virus, was released from prison today from China. And so even though that we are still going through a lot of bioethical hurdles, what is imparable is that we are definitely now modifying our own genetics. I mean, in vitro fertilization is another example that is absolutely acceptable in bioethical reviews. And so we are selecting the human beings that we want to become. And in a way, it's not very different as our slow process evolution of the fittest. Because in a way, I consider evolution being, you know, um, coming from, this desire to reach. So this quote from Sigmund Freud: "With every tool, man is perfecting his own organs, whether motor or sensory, or is removing the limits to their functioning," describes this human technology relationship. And if we understand the actual term of technology, all that technology means is the tools and methods for progress, for human progress. And so sometimes we think of technology as, the latest iPhone, but in reality, language and any other kind of tool or method is technology. And so technology allows us to co-evolve consciously. You can see this as a phenomena that it's not just being, happening in the art world by inquiry. You also have, the common public embracing medical devices that, were sometimes costly, at their wrists. They can now have EKG, and now I think that the new iWatch has the capability of an oximeter. And so these medical devices are becoming commodified kind of technology. And so this commodification of the quantified self um, is evidence that consumers are eager to adopt new sensory avenues by which to enhance their physiological mechanisms, which is kind of another evidence of how we are consciously evolving, and we are very aware of our biosignals and how to enhance our experience. So this growing interest in biometric oriented devices is an exemplary phenomena of the motives that drive this co-adaptive computing experiences and the interactive design of cognizant human evolution. So this eager adoption provides an outlook on the direction in which humans are co-evolving with their machines, and reveals the collective yet intimate demand for experiential intensification. So really, devices in our relationship to devices, I always consider all technology to be inherently assistive. So in a way, assistive technology is kind of an oxymoron, because a pencil is just as assistive as a wheelchair, but we have this terminology to specifically talk about abilities that are lacking, or disabilities rather. But technology really is a prosthetic for our human bodies and our human experience to intensify our ability to perceive the world around us, or to move through it, to traverse. And so all of these ideas and theories brought me to come up with a framework for artwork that is assistive, and it's also device art, and with the impetus of empowering diverse realities and to expand the sensory experience of human computer interaction. And so the fields of cross-modal psychology, assistive technology, and interactive design all kind of feed through to this framework. And so the assistive device art framework, it classifies, designs, and evaluate technology within the cross-section of assistive technology and art. It is a method by which to innovate on digital display technology and tool incorporation, while deeply investigating the structures of empirical contemplation, and as a way of reflecting on our perception through physical and sensory extensions. It takes inspiration from atypical physiologies and is a way of understanding our multimodal mediated perspective. It presents cognitive prosthetics as well as neuro prosthetics, and it contemplates and it allows for participants to also contemplate on what is skill, what is ability, and also allows people to experience the plasticity of our mind and the plasticity of our condition as human bodies. In other words, we are currently still evolving. And now that we are able to have a more direct involvement in the evolution of our physical conditions, it explores our relationship to the environment through technology. As like prosthetics prior to maybe genetically engineering different sense or a different motor ability. So this kind of art reimagines our future bodies. And so it proposes new avenues for human computer integration, often camouflaging itself as a consumer product, indulging in the illusion of escaping our experiential reality. So for me, it's important that these devices look approachable by a general consumer audience, because I'm interested in understanding how far are people willing to go to extend their senses, and how far are and what is appealing. I'm interested to understand appeal and desire, as far as bodily extensions and future bodies. And it also, by the same token, measures the public's willingness to engage with assistive technology. And so one thing that I always talk about with this idea is that, for example, glasses, even sunglasses, are assistive technology in the very sense of assistive technology as we know it, to help with our disabilities, or even reading glasses, for example. And it cannot be more of a fashionable object as well. And so we know that there is willingness for people to kind of forego their natural condition, and use assistive technology. And so how does something that is a sign of a mild disability, such as low vision, now become something that doesn't only make you look cool, but it also makes you look smarter? So these type of cultural phenomena, where disability starts being desirable, is something that I'm very interested in. So here's another example of maybe how disability could become desirable. This is my friend Rob Spence, aka Iborg. He had an accident where he lost his eye, and so he worked with Dr. Ling to create a camera that he could put as a prosthetic eye. And he is a documentary filmmaker. And so he was able to create the first film from the literal perspective of the eye of the documentarian. And so this phenomena of electric enhancement to the body may make some forms of disability desirable, perhaps. So at which extent are we willing to modify our bodies to incorporate technology that, while enhancing us, also temporarily disable us? Say, if we were able to create a bionic eye that would be able not just to record a movie, because obviously this device is not necessarily better than an eye, but eventually perhaps we could also have better vision. Maybe this eye could become a microscope and a telescope at the same time. How willing would we be to forego one of our natural eyes and enhance it with a bionic eye, for example? So how can we gain new sensibilities without the danger of loss? And, is it important that this assistive technology is not, going to create a loss, or does it have to be non-invasive? So this human adaptability is guided by our technological coevolution. As technology gets better, I think we are more willing to forego these things. But as we know, even in the world of plastic surgery, even if we are at rudimentary processes, people are still willing to forego these as quote unquote enhancements. For example, I remember reading about the plastic surgery that was done back in the day, and they would incorporate wax into their cheekbones to have higher cheekbones. And of course, the wax would start melting in a really hot day. And so people would kind of mold their faces at night with a candle and try to um, re I guess, sculpt their cheekbones. So we know that people are willing to forego these things. And of course, this is Stellark's third arm, which talks about prosthetics that are not necessarily replacing a normal body, quote unquote. And so, this is when we start talking about adding ability. Uh, thank you for the background music. Um, and so here you see how this third arm is, being part of this, body. And so this extension and how to, make this useful. Is it useful? Is it necessary? Is it really desirable? And so assistive device art kind of lives in this place where it's experimenting prior to maybe genetically coding an ear and an arm. Maybe we should try first what it's like to hear from our arms. This artwork by Stellark is also particularly interesting to me because it's really combining medicine and art in a way that is challenging the physical philosophy that art really is, and starts not only making artists question how far are we going through our medium or through our media, but all the way to enhancing our body directly by surgery, but also starts questioning, starts to make surgeons question how far are they able to go with our bodies, and how much of a sculptor they really can be. And so when I show this slide to a medical audience, they're also always very shocked. And in a way, it shocks me that they are shocked, because if they are willing and understand to do, for example, breast augmentations or any kind of plastic surgery, which is a totally aesthetic choice, then why would an ear be any different? Maybe it's just conceptually bizarre, and it's more understandable that a physiological enhancement such as breast augmentation is more acceptable, because clearly it will make you more attractive. To quote, I don't know, that's a matter of taste, but it's more acceptable than having an ear and an arm, and being an experimental about what if you could be able to move your ear around and hear better from your arm. This artwork also was meant to include a device that would have a microphone so that he could actually hear from it. I think that there was not a good biocompatibility with that, and so that part was foregone. But I know that he still has his arm, and I remember him telling me once that he was going through airport security, and they're like, "Oh, what is this?" And he tries to hide it, but oftentimes they'll pat him down and find an ear. So interesting, freedom for the design of our physiology, and evolving as we are in the moment, and not just waiting for humanity to slowly evolve. So the plasticity of the mind and sensory substitution devices is something that I do in my personal work. So beyond, extending motor control, like Stellark, or, creating this bionic camera like Bob Spence, I'm more interested in understanding our perception and how we perceive information, and how that's synthesized in our minds. And so this quote by Paul Bacurita, "We see with our brains, not with our eyes," is very clear, because what it's really talking about is that the actual perception and synthesizing of information happens in our minds, and not necessarily in our eyes. Like, someone may think that if you're blind, you cannot see. However, that is not really the case. there's a lot of evidence that blind subjects can, in experiments, can use their visual cortex very much, especially when reading Braille specifically, and for different tasks. So here's a question that was posed in 1688 by Molyneux, and it's called the sensory mapping philosophical problem. And the question is, if you knew this ball only by touch and scent and maybe taste, when the interaction that you have with it, with our environment, your proprioception, how your entire body relates to this object. If you were, born blind, you only knew it in this way, you had never seen it. And suddenly you had an operation and you were able to see for the first time. Do you think that you would be able to recognize that ball just by looking at it? I'd like you to think about it for a moment, and I don't know if you want to intervene and say yes or no, but I'll wait a few seconds and give you the answer. So the answer is no, because our cross-modal ability is based on learning. And so the understanding of vision for the first time, even if you've seen other things, doesn't mean that you understand that as a ball, because you have no point of reference for cross-mapping the sensory experience of this ball in any other way beyond like other than sight. And so it takes around 10 minutes of you touching this ball and kind of playing with this ball and looking at this ball for you to actually understand and recognize this as the ball, just by sight alone. And so this is an extremely amazing example of neuroplasticity and sensory substitution theories, where they suggest that the brain is moldable and adaptable and based on circumstantial conditions, such as change in behavior or the environment. So what we understand now, it took until 2011, where this ophthalmologist Pawan Sinha went to India and was able to cure some children that were born blind because they were born with curable disease. And he did this study so that he could finally answer this question with data. So it took until 2011 from 1688 for us to really understand, the cross-modal information that constitutes understanding, and therefore proving that our perception really is based on a learning experience and incorporation. So this is Paul Bacurita. You can see him there. He's one of the pioneers of sensory substitution. And what you see him wearing is the first iteration of his matrix conversion of vision. And so his glasses have this camera attached to them, and then you see a matrix on his hand that was meant to go on the back. And this camera would turn a black and white image into kind of this matrix of, protruding and retracting solenoids that then became the tongue display unit, which is the image you see at the top right, which is the size of a postage stamp matrix with electrodes instead of, these solenoids, which is a transducer that protrudes back and forth. And so with the same idea of converting a black and white image to electric pulses, his idea was to be able to give a sensory substitution module for people who are unable to see with their eyes, to have a kind of a tactile map of the visual information that they were facing, right? Since the camera was in the middle of their eyes, technically a third eye. And not only did he do this for vision, but he also did this for this woman called Cheryl, who had the unfortunate event of taking an antibiotic which atrophied her inner ear, and therefore all the cilia in her vestibular system, which is our sense of balance, was damaged. And so by putting a gyroscope and an accelerometer, which are these electronic sensors that allow you to know the position of something. For example, when you take your phone and you flip it horizontally and the image flips horizontally, that's the gyroscope of your phone telling it, hey, gravity is here. And so the gyroscope, the actual sensor, electronic sensor, functions in the same way that our vestibular sense works. And so what Paul did is he took this sensor and connected it to the tongue display unit. And so now instead of showing a black and white image or like an electrode image of the environment, it was giving Cheryl the information of where gravity was in relation to her head. And so what was incredible about this interface is that Cheryl was able to incorporate a vestibular sense from her tongue. And so she would it got to the point where she would wear this device for a couple of hours, and she could go weeks without wearing the device and not getting any more vertigo. And this is because she must have created a new link in her brain for her tongue to give her information about gravity, instead of having to rely on her atrophied vestibular system. And so part of why this works is because, like many other senses and like all of our perception, it's cross-modal. And so it's being informed by a lot of these sensors that we have, aka eyes and ears and so on. And so this is my series of sensory substitution devices that I called sensory pathways for a plastic mind. And I made a watch that tells time with scent, and a play grill, which is a mouthpiece that uses bone conduction for listening through your teeth, echolocation headphones, which allow you to see space through sound. And I also created the tongue display unit, albeit very small resolution compared to the actual one by Paul Baccarita's company, because I just couldn't believe that you could see through your tongue. So I began trying to understand sensory substitution with this artwork, even though it was the second one in the series that I created. And so here I made a matrix of electrodes, and I made a software that would be paired with it so that you could, for example, write an X or a T or a dot. And so a person would be able to put this tongue display unit in their mouths, and then go with their tongues around the electrodes and try to see what the image was by feeling kind of this tingling sensation of electrodes that are active versus electrodes that are off. And so what's interesting is that when I saw the tongue display unit at the beginning, I thought that you would get kind of like a picture in your mouth and you could kind of feel it and the, pad of your tongue. But what I discovered by actually testing it myself through my own interface is that you have to use the tip of your tongue, because that is the kind of, most sensitive area of your tongue. And so when you pass your tongue through these electrodes, you're able to understand this visual map that you cross-reference in your mind. So memory is spatial. We have a spatial map of our surrounding, and that's what allows us to really understand not only where we are within our environment, but also, give us an idea of our place in memory as well. I was inspired by Daniel Kish, one day when I saw a documentary about his ability to echolocate with tongue clicks. He is incredible. He can ride his bike, even though he cannot see with his eyes at all. The way that he sees is that by clicking his tongue, he's able to get an impression of his environment. And so he can understand where there are obstacles. And he also has put some cards on a wheel so that it clicks as he's writing, and he's taught many people to echolocate and gain a lot of spatial freedom to get around. And so I created the echolocation headphones, which is a pair of goggles that allow you to listen to space and navigate with sound. And so what's interesting about the speaker is that it uses an ultrasonic, a matrix of ultrasound transducers. And so it's different than a normal speaker. What it does is that it takes two ultrasonic sound waves, one of them being a carrier wave, similar to how you tune into a frequency in a radio. And so say it's like 92.7, and then there's an added sound wave to that, to the radio wave, which is the actual signal. So it could be Madonna, for example. And so in the similar way, instead of using radio waves, this is using ultrasonic waves. And so it uses two waves so that they can demodulate. When they bounce off of the surface, the positive and negative ultrasonic waves get demodulated, therefore kind of canceling each other out. And what's left is the audible signal. I like to use white noise because in the literature, there's evidence that we can locate and find our way better when we are trying to follow a white noise signal. For example, they use that sometimes in fire exits. So when there's a fire, there's a white noise emanating from a lot of fire exits so that you can find it easier because of all the different frequencies that it's hitting, so that it's able to kind of be noisier. And so with the same principle of location, I sometimes play white noise, and it could play any kind of thing because it's a speaker. So what it does is that by blinding the user and having this particular, parametric feature, it allows to have a focal point of audition similar to a focal point of vision. And so it's like having a finger to feel the imprint of our environment with sound. So we can also think of it as a laser of sound rather than, a big floodlight. So as I'm talking to you, the sound that's emanating from from your speakers is omnidirectional. So even if you're behind the computer, you can hear it, or if you're behind the speakers, you can hear it, because the sound wave that we are producing as we speak, which is in the audible spectrum, is a lot bigger than an ultrasonic sound wave. And so by kind of, I guess, squeezing the audible sound wave within this really high frequency wave, we are able to have directional sound. And so I was also inspired by these images that I found by in Madeline Schwartzman's See Yourself Sensing book about these World War I listening devices. So we had bomber planes, but we still didn't have radar technology to detect enemy planes. And so the human solution was to sit soldiers within these listening devices. However, with time, I took them off because I had a friend who's blind to test my device, and he said, "Take these things off. They are screwing me up." And so, given that he's blind, I thought he probably knows a lot better than I do, because obviously, people who are used to navigating space through sound cues are more attuned to these nuances in the environment. And so here is kind of like a diagram that shows this smaller sound wave in pink going in one direction, and then kind of this greenish orange sound wave, which would be the audible sound coming back. And so you really can't hear the device if you are wearing it and looking into the void, for example, like a big park or something like that. You won't be able to hear the speaker if you're next to it unless you're directly in front of it. And so this is why this device is so good for people who are sighted to learn to echolocate. So it's in a way a prosthetic for people who can see but want to learn to echolocate, rather than for people who are blind who need to echolocate, because it's not a very pleasant device to be wearing around as an assistive device for practical reasons. And this project is the scent rhythm, which is about smelling time. So in the same idea of sensory substitution and trying to see how we can connect one sense to the other and create this multimodal perspective, I was thinking about our chronoception, our sense of time, and how that is mainly a chemical thing. If you think about it, you can have time pass very quickly or very slowly, depending on how you've become chemically enhanced, or depending on the neurotransmitters that are being kind of generated in your brain. And so I thought that it would be really interesting to pair this chronoceptive idea to our olfactory sense, because it's also a chemoreceptor. And so the idea was to turn the day and divide it into quarters. And so you would have a period of rising, which would be in the morning, a period of alertness, a period of unwinding, and a period of dozing off to sleep. And so I didn't only just put scents, but in the morning it would smell like coffee. And the idea was that it would also have, homeopathic doses of caffeine. And during the day, the alertness stage, I tried to make it smell like money. And so I found this company that had very weird scents. And so I took tarnish and paper. And then also would be paired with something like ginkgo biloba, or something that would, kind of amp you up. And then the unwinding cycle maybe smelled like tobacco and whiskey or something like that, and give you some gabapentin to relax. And then dozing off would have melatonin and maybe smell like chamomile or lavender, something like this. Obviously, the idea of the scents is that they could, be changed depending on whatever scent you'd like, aesthetically, but also the neurotransmitters could be adjusted. So in a way, this could also be a drug delivery watch, or it could also put you on time. So not only would it kind of give you chemicals to put you, to give you neurotransmitters that are coherent with the time of the day and as you should be, energetically, but it could also give you a boost of energy, perhaps in the middle of the day. If you needed some caffeine, you can woof it up. And so even though this was a project where I didn't collaborate with any neuroscientists, it's still open for collaboration, as far as it becoming this kind of drug delivery, neurotransmitter delivery device. And lastly, which is interesting that I put it last, because actually this was the first artwork in the series, is the player grill. And the idea came from understanding that you can listen through your teeth. And so the way that you can listen through your teeth is because your teeth are embedded in your jaw, which is very near the inner ear bones. And so when your inner ear bones are vibrated to the frequency of sound you can hear, bypassing your eardrum, very similar to how cochlear implants function. Cochlear implants oftentimes, consist of a screw being attached to the skull. And so that screw will vibrate the skull to the sound that it's being received by a microphone in the device. And so I wanted to pair it with a grill, which is, this rap and R&B device, fashionable accessory. And I always thought it's a kind of interesting how this music object that isn't musical or there's no audio interface to it, is so iconic for a musical movement, obviously to do with culture and so on, and the aesthetics of a music movement in general. But I thought it would be really interesting to actually make it the music player itself. And so while it's very interesting because the bass is not as audible through this method because the wave is so much bigger. So the higher the frequency, the smaller the sound wave. And so obviously higher frequencies are easier to pass through solids. And so that was the first iteration. A second iteration where I was thinking more about usability and how comfortable it was to press buttons with your tongue. And so I designed this lever kind of interface for you to change the tunes and play it. However, I have to say the tongue is a very difficult digit, quote unquote, to design for, because what I learned is that the fact that we don't have a bone in the tongue makes it very difficult to press things, and that our fingers are really mainly useful because of the bony part that's embedded in the middle of our bones. And so here you can see kind of the entrails of it, where it's an MP3 player that is then being paired with these transducers. And really what they are is just vibrating motors, because technologically, or technically, the speaker and the motor are essentially the same kind of electronic component. They are both electromagnets that, when you pass electricity through it, depending on the voltage, it will turn in one direction or the other. And with music, the signal coming from your audio jack is just electric signals that go up and down, oscillating in the frequency of sound. And so if you were to put a membrane to a motor and connect a motor to an audio jack, you would be creating a speaker essentially, because the electromagnet inside of the motor would just amplify the signal. And what really makes a speaker is this like flimsy plastic, or sometimes it's kind of a papery membrane that will push the air up and down, and then that air modulation is what we then hits your eardrum and oscillates. And so because we're bypassing the eardrum and air at all you need is the actual motor, or quote unquote electromagnet, to be directly placed to your teeth, which are kind of have a shortcut to your inner ear. And this was a project that I did in pair with the echolocation kind of idea. It's a parallel sense of touch underwater. And it uses ultrasound again. It seems like ultrasound is really a running theme in my work. But essentially, it's a sonar that you can see here at the bottom of the wrist. And the idea is that it senses the topography underwater and then sends signals to these transducers, which are tactile stimulators. So the way that they work is that the water goes here through into this chamber through the impeller. So it has motors that suction water into the device and then propel it to this canal that then pushes it to the volar tips of our fingers. And so it's almost like putting a finger under a tap of water. So you can feel the pressure changing of the water. And so the idea was to give us parallel sense of touch underwater for searching underwater or for circumstances such as, blind swimming, things like that. Not always can you see where you're getting into. But the idea of this device came also from actually trying to understand how we could do haptics for virtual reality underwater. And so this actual module for haptic display could perhaps give us the ability to, feel a virtual object underwater. So not just for giving a parallel sense of touch, or giving some sort of tactile echolocation underwater, but also as inventing, a new type of display. So trying to figure out how to make available more information from our environment. And this project has nothing to do with sensory substitution at all. The series now that you've seen, Iruka Tact, which was the glove underwater, is it's you've seen the series now. But this project is also very related to physiology and anatomy, and how we are able to kind of plug and play with our systems, our human body. And so this is called a galvanic vestibular stimulator. And while that's a mouthful, you may remember Vestibular from the previous project I was telling you about by Paul Baccarita and Cheryl, who had lost her sense of balance. So the vestibular system is how we sense our balance. And so the way that it works is that we have these canals full of water, and we have cilia that live inside these canals, or it's not water, it's probably like spinal cerebral fluid or some sort of fluid. And so we have rings that go vertically, horizontally, at an angle. And so as you move your head around, the cilia are giving information to your body about where your head position is in relation to gravity. And so what's interesting is that, gravity is a very weak force. And so it could be bypassed by electricity. And so when you pass an electric current from one mastoid bone to the other, which is kind of that bone that you can feel right under your ears, that is part of your skull, that's where you place the electrodes. And so as the electricity is being passed from negative to positive, you are creating a stream of electricity that takes the cilia and moves it to that direction. And so what happens is that your sense of balance is kind of being taken over by this electric pulse, and your body starts compensating for that gravity shift. And as you can see, this participant, I will be remote controlling him, and as I move the control, he will be kind of feeling like he's falling over, and so he will compensate. And so the way that I did it, obviously the tree is much more information than the actual device. As you can see, he alone was able to just open his eyes and navigate, because as I said, the vestibular system is informed not only by our vestibular sense, but our eyes as well. And so when we're doing this, when we're experiencing this artwork, the participant is asked to close their eyes, so that the sole information for balance that they have is from their vestibular system. And so because the idea is that the electricity passes in one direction, and so you compensate by going in the opposite direction, I just changed the visual cue of the remote so that you could make it so that if you press right, they're actually going to start veering to the right, even though the actual electrical signal is going in the opposite direction. And lastly, I wanted to show you this artwork about a genetic matchmaker that I did in collaboration with Hilal from Parsons, and she's also a bioartist. And we did this. We had this idea that maybe we could do a dating service, which was a genetic matchmaker, even though it sounds very dangerous. Our idea was to take the information from this T-shirt experiment that was done in the 70s, where they took I think it was like 7 t-shirts, and made 7 guys wear these t-shirts for a long time. I think it was like 2 weeks. And so these t-shirts were very stinky. And they made a group of women smell them and kind of rate them in terms of attractiveness, because I'm sure all of you by now may have had a partner or two and have been enthralled by their scent, and thought that they just smell incredible. And even though maybe it could be supposed to be a stinky smell, there's something attractive to it that we can't quite place. Well, it turns out that when they did the when they sequenced the DNA of both the participants, the male participants as well as the females, they realized that women were rating as more attractive the men that smelled, that the men that had the most different HLA genes than them. And so the more different their HLA genes were, the more attracted they were. And so what this means is that the HLA gene codes for immunity. And so when you're coding for immunity, when your body's coding for immunity and is becoming attracted to a totally different HLA gene, it means that you probably have better chances of your offspring having a more complete immune system. And so since then, the study has been kind of, debunked and then reinstated and so on. But the idea of this artwork was that we could then get genetic samples from people, and then we could look at the DNA and then quantify the potential matches, and then invite people to parties where they could kind of meet each other and see if they had already HLA genes that were different enough to match with each other. The project didn't go all the way through because we were doing this in Turkey. Hilal Koyuncu is from Turkey. And so we were trying to figure this out in Turkey. And at the time, the technology hadn't gotten there. It was when 23andMe had to shut down the actual health part of their services because law was still kind of catching up to these genetic information services. And so our idea then was put in pause, and then Hillel started working for a big company, and so we stopped it immediately before they could take the idea. However, it's still considered an artwork and in its conceptual form. And lastly, I wanted to show you a project that I'm still working on at the University of Texas Medical Branch, where I run this prototyping lab. And it's URUS, which is a pressure cuff actuated emergency use resuscitator system. So during the pandemic, I was working with Dr. Chris Zanner, and we were seeing the impossible triaging decision that Italian doctors were having to make, where they were only ventilating patients under 60 years old, which is very young. And so we were seeing this happening, and we thought that we better start creating some sort of makeshift ventilator system so that people that were triaged or left out in the triage process were able to at least get some sort of opportunity to be ventilated. And so this emergency ventilation system was designed for resilience, adaptability, and safety. And it was done with medical supplies and common electronic components that we would find inside of the hospital. And so here you can see the interface itself. It has an ambu bag, which is a manual resuscitator. It's the purple kind of bladder that you see there. And that actually goes to the patient through the cord on the left. And then we designed this box, which consists of 2 valves that go onto a blood pressure cuff. I don't know if you've taken your blood pressure, but usually there's a cuff that you place around your arm that inflates to be able to measure your heart rate. And so each patient room in a hospital has 2 ports of air and vacuum, and actually it has a third one for oxygen. but we don't use oxygen except if you want to add oxygen to the line directly to the patient. And so the air from the vacuum and the air ports only inflates the blood pressure cuff, and then it uses the vacuum to quickly evacuate the air so that we can reach the actual breaths per minute necessary in order for, to create a, normal breathing rhythm. And we can also control the volume. And now we've made it so that it actually can be an assist control. So in ventilators, there are two types of ventilation that you can provide. You can essentially completely go automated, full on breathing for the patient. And you could also do a assisted breathing for the patient, and which was the case for most of the COVID patients that we were having, which means that they can't get enough pressure. So the breaths that they take are very shallow. And so as they start to breathe, we have a sensor, which was a medical grade sensor, and was the only sensor that we had incorporated at the time, would be able to understand that the patient is trying to breathe. And so we would push air into their lungs as soon as they were attempting on their own. And so here's the diagram for the patent application we did. We did get a provisional patent for this project that we let lapse so that it could always remain in the public domain and nobody could kind of close source it and patent it themselves. So here you see all the parts, and it has, a PEEP valve, which controls pressure, which was one of the biggest hurdles through COVID patients, was that people weren't able to maintain adequate pressures for their breathing. It all obviously had an N95 exhaust filter, and I don't know, I need to explain what N95 means anymore because we're all so very much educated on PPE after this pandemic. It also has a pop-up valve to make sure that we don't pressurize the lungs too much. And of course, the blood pressure cuff. And the controls are IE ratio, which is inhalation exhalation ratio, the tidal volume, which is how much air we're pushing into the lungs of the patient, the breaths per minute, and then a control for how sensitive we wanted the pressure sensor to be when we're trying to detect the breath of a patient in case that they weren't completely unconscious and unable to breathe on their own. So without further ado, thank you very much for your attention. I hope that you have many questions for me. I'd love to begin a conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was just absolutely mind-blowing and amazing. Aisen. That was, everybody has been making comments in the chat about how completely clear you are in terms of, hey, look, hello, in terms of explaining all of this. It's just really beautiful. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And everybody, please speak up, put questions in the chat, whatever you want. I mean, I'm sure that there's lots of them floating in your heads. We're going to keep going a little later just because this is too good not to. So I love it. Thank you. I guess, one of the things that really amazes me is the way that you have thought through these devices so that they feel like, at one point you mentioned when you were talking about Daniel Kish and then the development of the echolocation headphones, this idea about, creating kind of spatial freedom for people who maybe, needed that to navigate. And just this whole notion about freedom, seems to come to my mind every time I think about any of these devices, because you're really allowing for another kind of extension, another kind of understanding, another kind of perception, as you said. And I just kind of want to, ask you maybe more as a bigger container of looking at all of the work from some other conceptual position. Is there a place where you begin when you start thinking about these works? Like that, or because they're so technologically dense, but they also are so just philosophically amazing. So
I kind of had to become an engineer out of my curiosity. I just
Mhm.
needed to experience these things. So it's more, they come from wanting to listen through your teeth and wanting to see with your tongue and, try to understand what echolocating really feels like and what it, perceptually does to your brain. Um, People who are blind and naturally do this. Actually, I've given this talk, and someone told me my grandson is born blind, and he started doing this on his own. So he started clicking his tongue and tried to find the objects that he was playing with. And so this is kind of a super ability that most of us don't develop because we have sight. And so what's incredible for me is that we can and we have these abilities. However, we need prosthetics to kind of get there. And so a lot of times, the impetus of these artworks kind of fall into place in different ways. They're all different because inspiration comes from different places. The echolocation headphones was kind of a mishmash. Actually, Mark Ducillier was there when I started the idea of this. He brought this parametric speaker to Megan Dadler's house, and I put it to my ear, and then I started kind of like, scanning the space. And this was a very strong speaker. And so we were in a backyard and you could hear the imprint of the environment. And then I put it in my face, kind of close, shutting my eyes. And so I started understanding how this is giving me a focal point of audition, which is weird because we can't do that, right?
Mhm.
Because sound is omnidirectional and our sense of hearing is by default omnidirectional. And so by having this like kind of, ability to focus where the sound, how the sound is going to be received, um, you know, created this situation. And then I had learned about Daniel Kish. And so this all came together and I understood that this could be a really good way for us to really experience what echolocation feels like for someone who may only have a couple of minutes to try to learn and understand. So the Playgirl came out of going to the museum. I forget the name of San Francisco Museum, and kind of like listening through my elbows or something like that. And then I realized, well, what would be cool is to make these grills, be able to play music. And so all of these ideas kind of come from this curiosity in general about our anatomy and our physiology and how and then the understanding that we are kind of plug and play, physiological, gack or sculpting clay, is what makes it fascinating, and then starts inspiring me to do more and understand more on how far we can go with our physiology. If you think about it, how do we start sensing at all? I think the sense of vibroception was probably the first sense we developed as living things. It makes sense, right? And so that turns into not only tactile, perception, but also sound, that's a vibration. So mechanoreceptions probably, or maybe chemoreception, actually, being that we need to eat. I'm not sure. But all of these, receptions kind of get um, incorporated by not just need, but desire, right? Because how is it that life has evolved in so many directions? And I think that there's some sort of desire to, you know, develop a hand because we want to grab something, or develop wings because, we want to fly. And I say we as living things, right? I'm like giving us extra powers in that sense. But hopefully now that we are able to genetically modify, we can, go beyond, what the natural evolution of the human body would be. And assistive device art is a great place to kind of trial these things, like do we want to sense electromagnetic fields in, by tact, how people are embedding magnets and so on. So
We've got Cheryl. Thanks so much for that. That was great. And Cheryl, you're up next.
Oh yeah, hi.
Hi.
First of all, amazing work, really incredible, what you're doing. And I just was wondering, so with the play a grill, so can you hear the music outside of the mouth as well, or it's just for the person?
It's for the person because it's by conduction, but you can hear a little bit because the cavity of the mouth kind of starts, the vibration that's happening inside of your mouth does kind of project a bit, but the actual, the bulk of what you're going to be hearing is from conduction. So just by, sound can travel through air, it can travel through solids, it could also travel through liquids. Actually, it travels a lot faster through liquids than through solids because, molecules are tighter together. And so it's a vibration. And so, if you push a line of very tight people, you'll make them fall, etc. If they're further apart, it takes them a few steps before they hit someone else, right? So that's kind of the principle of it.
Parents might like it for their kids, so they don't have.
Yeah, I thought it'd be cool. You could cheat on your exam, and you just wear some retainers and, have all the answers.
Anyways, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Any other questions from anyone? I would love to hear others. There's some really amazing people in the audience here still with us. So anybody else have any?
Well, if nobody has questions, please email me.
What are you doing next? Just wondering, what are some of your next exciting dreams and visions?
Well, at the moment, I'm working on creating, I've put my email in the chat so that everyone can have my contact. But right now, I'm working on a lot of projects at the hospital. So, I actually just got done making some torture devices for mice. They're burning mice in the back so that they're doing some skin research. So sometimes my work is not the nicest, but I'm working on creating ultrasonic paintings because I do a lot of surgery simulation models and simulation models for the hospital. And one of the things that we're doing is ultrasound for IV cannulation. So nurses have to learn how to use the ultrasound. And so I've made models that seem like a vein, but I thought this would be a really cool way to make images and make, art that you have to see through ultrasound. I'm also working with a radiology student right now to make some X-ray artwork. And as far as interfaces, the ventilator is still very much part of my daily work. We are working on getting it to animal studies, which is going to be incredibly important for the art aspect of this project because it's going to be talking about sustaining life and the precarious situation of what it's like to be tethered to our lives through our machines. And so for me, actually having the animal experimentation part will be very revealing as well for the process of how we come up with this technology and how we enhance humanity and how animals are kind of in the middle of that. And yeah, so the actual critical aspect of this, it's not entirely developed because we haven't gone through the animal studies yet. But as an artist going through this process and not just as a scientist, I hope to be very conscious about the humanistic aspects of this. And I have another artwork we're making, Code Zen Room, which is for medical practitioners to sit in and kind of honor the emotions that come with a job. So a lot of times they lose patients and that creates a lot of frustration and sadness, and they can't just sit and cry while they're in the units. And so we're creating a room where they can go and honor their emotions. And so while this is not very highly technical, it's something that we're doing and kind of incorporating in this very clinical environment, very clinical and corporate environment, trying to talk about emotions is kind of a weird, but very necessary thing that's happening. The burnout rates are insane, especially now.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We look forward to seeing all of those new pieces. They sound just amazing. And everybody listen, come next week. We have another one of these talks. And that will be with Anna Lindemann, Evo Devo Art. Anna's been working with ants and ant colonies, and it's going to be a great talk as well. But for now, I just really want to have everyone thank Aisen, because this was mind-blowing and a wonderful way to end the week. Thank you for sharing this all with us. And thank you all for coming. Really nice to see you all.